Element, detached dissimulations of scramjet combustor. These are some of the complex geometries where with US3D, the team at Minnesota was able to provide high fidelity flow predictions which match numerically stable. So I will show a little bit detail of some of these going further down. So the US3D code flow solver, which is the data parallel line relaxation flow solver. So basically DPLR was used at NASA for hypersonic flow problems, but it was a structured code and it was not massively parallelized. So then US3D enabled unstructured grid so that people can model complex vehicle geometries. And due to the parallelization of the code, the pre-processing, post-processing, and the solver performance greatly improved. The solver has extension for unsteady simulations such as hybrid RANs, LES, DNS, etc. Numerics is mainly upwind schemes using modified Steger warming methods and muscle fluxes. And we also have high order low dissipative fluxes, which are kinetic energy consistent fluxes, KEC. So we have second, fourth, and sixth order. These flux schemes give great numerical accuracy for problems with large Reynolds numbers. I will show some of the examples going forward. And then we have a variety of forms of dissipation, limiters, shock sensors, the time integration schemes. The code is mainly reputed for its implicit solver algorithm, which enables for large time stepping for large grids, but also we have explicit high order time integration methods as well. Another feature is the decoupled implicit method, which basically allows to solve chemistry versus total energy equation separately. So then if the flow physics is not strongly coupled, you can save a lot of time doing a decoupled calculations. And as I said earlier, the code is designed to scale for large grids and processor counts. And the code outputs are mainly in tech plot format, so which is mainly used for scientific computations. For high fidelity simulations, the code has almost all the state of the art gas physical and kinetic models. There is a modeling for thermochemical non-equilibrium, for dissociating and ionized flows. So you just, so we because the code is developed as a joint collaboration between NASA and Minnesota, we have the chemistry files for almost all gases and whatever database is available in the literature. There has been development on vibrational electronic energy relaxation mechanisms, catalytic wall boundary conditions, heat transfer and ablation, etc. For these, especially the re-entry problems. The RANS turbulence models have all the, so I am mentioning only a few of them here, but as the code has been advanced, it has almost all the available turbulence models in the literature. People from my research group, they have also performed global and boundary layer stability analysis using DMD, dynamic mode decomposition, and SPDMD, the sparsity promoting dynamic mode decomposition. So I was not able to include an example for these problems, but again, people who are interested, they can always go back and check the website or something. The US3D code also has moving grid capability, depending on which is mainly useful for fluid structural interactions and conjugate heat transfer problems. In last few years, there has been a huge development on adaptive mesh refinement. So the wake flow behind these space vehicles can be modeled using AMR, which saves a lot of time. There is also work going on in Lagrangian particle tracking. So, and then FMDF, which is filtered mass density function. So I will just show the snapshot of US3D workflow. We mainly have three primary steps. First is the grid generation. So basically you can use any commercially available grid generator such as Pointwise, GridGen, etc. And then the input file should be in Fluent format. Then the US3D comes with a preprocessor, solver, and post-processor subroutines. So then the preprocessors will convert this grid file into a .h5 format, and then we can give the solution input file, which basically defines the parameter for the solver, and the chemistry file, and then you solve the flow. An additional feature is that you can also extract slices from the computational domain during the runtime. So for example, if you are running a full trajectory of a space vehicle, you can keep extracting solution on a slice of the computational domain to track the transient growth of the flow evolution. Finally, when we have solved the simulation to a converged numerical solution, it generates a data.h5 file and a connectivity file, so that which is supplied to the US3D post-processor subroutine, which converts it to text plot data, and then you can visualize the flow. So it's a very simple process. And then again, the installation comes with user manual and quick start guide. So it's very easy to follow these processes. Other than that, so we have the main flow solver, but again, the CFD is a field of constant improvement. There are always new models coming up. So we have these three main three categories: US3D pre-bar, solver, and post-bar. Other than that, we also have features like US3D file, where you can check the file characteristics and run information as the solver is running. The GenBC module helps you in generating the boundary condition information for the input file. So basically you provide the grid, and if you are a new user, you run this module and it will give you a sample input file, which will indicate what kind of inputs are required. So it's very useful for new users. The other feature is US3D interp, which basically interpolates a solution from one grid to other. It's mainly useful for like when you are changing grids from one simulation runtime to another. Basically, I used this feature in my PhD project, so I will be talking a little bit more about it as we go forward. And then the last and most important subroutine is US3D util, or the utilities, which is an entry point for general access to US3D functions and utilities. So mostly like if you want to define your own numerical flux scheme or time integration scheme or a turbulence model, chemistry model, or you want to like call another solver within US3D, which is mainly we do in fluid structure interaction problems, that all can be done from the US3D util. So again, there is a lot of detail which is available if somebody wants to use it. There is a user manual and there is help. So I'm just giving an overview here. So now I will highlight some of the differences it has from DPLR, which was the original code at NASA. And this US3D has low dissipation numerics. So as I was mentioning earlier, we have high order fluxes. So for example, sorry, I'll just move it here. So most of the CFD methods for high speed, they use upwinding methods. Which work well for the steady laminar flows, But as the flow physics is more complicated, the dissipation and damping given by the upwinding methods is huge. So it basically washes out some of the key flow features. So in US3D, there is, my colleagues, they have implemented kinetic energy flux consistent schemes, where they basically have the discrete kinetic energy flux, which is in every time step of the solver, they make sure that the kinetic energy is conserved in the discrete sense. And then this is developed for second, fourth, and sixth order accuracy. The dissipation here is added using the shock sensor. So only in the regions where the shock is present, the scheme turns into a first order high dissipative scheme. Other than that, the numerical dissipation is low. So this basically allows for a big, for the simulation of another class of problems. So I'm showing a compressible mixing layer simulation result. And with the third order upwind method, you basically capture these big vortices, but flow physics inside is kind of lost. And using a lower order method, but which is kinetic energy consistent, you can still capture the key flow physics in a great detail. So that's the beauty of using low dissipation numerics in US3D, which is different from DPLR. Another thing I mentioned was the decoupled chemistry. So this is a sample example for 32 reactions, air and CO2 system. And this was a Mach 15 flow for 21 species. Using DPLR, the CPU time was huge. And using a decoupled method in US3D, the computational time is greatly reduced. So I am showing this chart only to emphasize on the fact that this feature was not available in DPLR, which is now in US3D. Okay, so now I will go and show like one slide for some of the example problems performed by my colleagues. So this is just a snapshot of hypersonic bond delay transition studies performed by my colleagues. This is done, this is the transition studied only for single element. So there is this cylindrical element mounted in wall of Purdue Mach 6 tunnel. And the coin here is just for scale. So it's a very small cylinder. And then there were experiments performed. The data was available. So the numerical methods and fluxes, etc., were developed. And finally, the simulations were performed on a 270 million grid. So my colleagues were able to find a very good match with the simulation and experiment shown here. So we are showing the surface pressure fluctuation. The blue color is simulation and the red color is experiment. So basically we are able to they were able to capture the peaks. Of course, there are some differences in the lower values, but peaks were accurately captured. And just for comparison, the lower plot shows here the power spectral density as a function of frequency. And then the 4 different lines are solutions obtained using higher order fluxes. So second, fourth, and sixth order KEC versus third order upwind flux scheme. And you see that the upwind flux scheme is predicting a completely different PSD data. So if you don't have this low dissipation numerics enabled in the solver, you won't be able to capture this. So again, this just emphasizes the strength of low dissipation numerics. Another example problem is the flow over an elliptic cone. So this is a geometry of high fire 5 vehicle, which is just an experimental vehicle to study hypersonic flight phenomena. So my colleagues, again, they developed a basic state wall heat flux. Sorry, they computed a basic flow state. And then the main goal here was to capture the flow instabilities on an elliptic cone flow configuration. And if you see just the base flow, it seems very smooth, while in reality there will be instabilities. So that was captured by providing a surface roughness. So again, this feature was developed as a module in US3D utilities. The main flow solver did not have this feature. So basically, all the computational grid on the surface of the vehicle was fed with a coarse roughness distribution, which was again interpolated for finer and finer grids. And then finally so for example, going from top to bottom, you start with this coarse distribution, you give it in the code, and then you interpolate it for the finer grid, because your actual grid has this fine distribution. You go from top to bottom, and then this was applied on the surface, and then finally the calculations were run, and this is the wall heat flux for 2 So you see the flow field is completely different. So so again, I included this example to show that there are certain things which are not present in the solver by default, but as we keep solving more and more complicated problem, on the way we keep developing more and more features which enable for high fidelity predictions. Another example is on boundary layer transition vehicle, so or abbreviated as BOLT. So this is a kind of a hot topic these days in hypersonics community. This was funded by Air Force, and then the flight experiment is scheduled in 2021. Basically, this geometry has is a good test case to study complex hypersonic flow phenomena. And also it has different materials. So as you see on the nose, they have TZM, and then going back, we have stainless steel and aluminum. So basically the heat transfer between these different materials and the thermal response, the prediction of that is of interest. So again, my colleagues developed techniques to do the conjugate heat transfer. Okay, so another thing to mention is the bolt flow physics itself and the stability analysis. It's a big research topic. Many of my colleagues are working on that, and even Professor Candler will be talking about bolt flow tomorrow in his talk. So I'm not talking about the flow, but talking here more about the heat transfer. So there was a conjugate heat transfer code developed, which basically does a FSI calculation between the solid and the fluid domain, and predicts the surface heating at the point. So surface heating and internal heating results are shown at 487 seconds, which is basically the top of descent point for the proposed flight trajectory for this vehicle. So my main point to show this was that we are able to predict the simulation. We are able to predict the temperature both in the fluid and the solid domain. Since the experiment is not yet performed, the validation is not done. But based on these results, it shows that all the materials stay well within their melting point limit, which is a good way. So that's all on bolt. Another example is on type 6 shock-shock interactions on a double wedge flow. So again, a lot of work is done by my colleagues, and if some student is working on this particular configuration, I can point them to those papers, and even my colleagues. But I just wanted to show here that this is a very heavily shock dominant flow, and the angles are shown here. So basically, using AMR, the adaptive mesh refinement, um, my colleagues were able to perform 6 different levels of AMR and control the instabilities in this region. So for example, the plot on the right is the wedge surface pressure with varying level of AMR. And going from solid line in red to dash line in red, we are increasing the levels of AMR. And with that, the fluctuations near the shock front. So basically the shock front is here where you see the peak. And if you have just single level of AMR, which is the solid red line, the oscillations near the shock are big. And as once you keep increasing the levels of AMR, the oscillations are damped and you can basically converge to equilibrium flow solution. So this was again a paper written by my colleague, and it was to show the capability of AMR to simulate these flows in a numerically stable manner. Okay, and the next one is on effect of steady suction boundary conditions on cone flare flow field. So again, a cone flare flow field has these these regions of shock and expansion fan. The main point was that there can be Gartler instabilities arising in this flow configuration because of this curved streamline structure due to the presence of the flare. And my colleague wanted to study if we can control the base flow and also the instabilities by using wall boundary conditions. He chose to apply section boundary conditions. And then um, based on some base flow analysis and the flow structure, he came up with a location to apply the suction BCs in the fore and aft region, which are highlighted here. And he observed that there was a difference in the base flow if you apply a suction BC in the forward region versus aft region. So the plots shown here are the density contours of 2 simulation results. The top one is when you have the suction BC on the forward of the body, and the second one is at the aft suction BC. And you see that there is a presence of this strong recompression shock, which is not present if you have a forward suction. So there was an impact, but again, it was also impacting the base flow itself. So again, for more details, interested readers can go to paper by employing user-defined boundary conditions and find a numerically stable solution. Okay, so I talked about my colleagues' work, and I will also talk a little bit about my PhD project. I will not go into too much detail. I thought it can be too much information for just one talk. So I will just give an overview. So using US3D, we also performed the simulations of atmospheric entry shock tube experiments. So basically the high temperature flow physics surrounding the space vehicle is important for the design of heat shield. And those re-entry conditions can be replicated in the shock tube experiments. So NASA Ames Research Center has this East shock tube facility, which is kind of unique. You can test a variety of test gases here, and you can generate shock speeds all the way up to 40 section, where you fill the dry. It is separated from the test gas, which is filled in the rest of the tube using a diaphragm. The test gas section has shock detectors along the tube. So the tube is about 8 meters long from the diaphragm until the test section, where there are 4 CCD cameras So once the driver gas is electrically heated, the diaphragm breaks, and then the driver gas starts compressing the test gas, creating a shock which moves towards the test section at a high speed. And when the shock is here, the CCD cameras capture the image of the shock in different wavelength regimes. And depending on that data, one can back calculate gas kinetic and spectroscopic properties, which can be used to verify and validate those models which are used in CFD. So, however, understanding this test data is kind of challenging because there are limitations in measurement techniques. This flow is a high enthalpy, non-equilibrium flow. There is a huge disparity of length and time scales. For example, at high speeds, the shock and the boundary layer at the tube walls are of the order of millimeter to 8 meters to reach test section. The numerics is strongly coupled, and this is a long time integration problem because you are capturing the tiny time scale where the chemistry and physics is happening at hypersonic speeds, and then you are traveling from 0 to 8 meters, so it becomes a long time integration problem. And in terms of numerical stability, accurate prediction of numerical propagation of this shock wave on computational grid becomes important. And capturing all the key important flow features becomes computationally expensive. So my main goal in my PhD was to simulate the Earth and Titan entry experiments for 6 to 11 kilometer velocity range. So on this slide, I just want to give an idea of the shock tube flow physics. So in the beginning of the experiment, we have kind of this schematic driver gas separated by the test gas, which is nitrogen in case of Earth or Titan. And the test section is at 8 meter. So first we heat the gas by electric arc, which is a 3-dimensional unsteady process. And then the diaphragm breaks. Diaphragm rupture again is a 3-dimensional unsteady FSI problem. As the shock moves from diaphragm to test section, there is a formation of boundary layer at the wall, which again interacts with the shock and leads to the deceleration and curving of the shock at the wall, which is one of the dominant physical phenomena happening in the shock tube. So once you have the shock at the test section, it's not a normal shock wave anymore. And once the shock is there, CCD cameras capture the image of the shock. So I'm showing a sample test image published by Cruden. This is for air shock at 9.93 kilometer per second. Basically, these are the radiative intensity contours of this region, and the x-axis is just the distance along this line, along this window of test. So, and then given the radiative intensity in different wavelength regime, people can identify different species and their concentration, the location of shock front, etc. So from the test, we have the shock deceleration along the tube and also electron number density data at the test section of the shock gas. So there is a huge range of data available for a variety of test conditions for Jupiter, Mars, Titan, all the speeds, etc. However, the data collected here is a radially averaged spectroscopic data, which has a combined effect of various mechanisms. So a 3D unsteady process, there can be formation of secondary shock waves, which can introduce some instabilities in the shock, and then those instabilities can grow in the boundary layer region. And another physical phenomena which can happen is backward. So shock moves from left to right, from right to left, and it can come back accelerated and can interact with the shock. So these are some of the physical phenomena which we do not know. It depends on the shock speed and how the experiment was performed. Other than that, there are some minor effects of wall roughness and ablation. So again, the wall is not perfectly smooth. There are instrumentation probes for detecting the shock arrival at throughout the shock tube, which kind of act as a tripping element and can transition the boundary layer from laminar to turbulence. And being a high speed flow, there is no measurements done at this point at the walls. So we don't even know if the flow is actually turning to turbulence or is it laminar. There is also possible radiative cooling for shock speeds greater than 13 kilometer per second. It becomes a major factor for higher shock speeds. But for my problem, it was physically correct to ignore the radiative cooling. So basically, I highlighted some of the challenges, but however, sorry, I'll go back to that slide. I moved the wrong way, sorry. So yeah, here I highlighted some of the challenges, but modeling everything all together in a computationally feasible manner is difficult. So what I did, I kind of simplified the flow in the east facility. So we ignored the 3D unsteady process of electric arc heating and assumed that, okay, at the beginning of the simulation, we have a uniformly heated driver gas and the diaphragm is fully open. So then we have a normal shock wave propagating from the diaphragm to the test section. And I ignored the radiative cooling, which was okay at that speed. The wall roughness and ablation effects were ignored. And my main focus was on capturing the shock boundary layer interaction, basically quantifying the shock deceleration due to the presence of boundary layer. So with that, there were, again, I will not go into too much detail, but a conventional way can be to model the full shock tube and resolve all the length and time scales which are important. And researchers have been trying to simulate this facility since 2009. But then as you start from the diaphragm and you start propagating the shock as it moves forward along the way, in every solver iteration, the numerical instabilities keep building, and then by the time they reach 2 meter or 3 meter or at this section, the flow becomes distorted. So the shock front structure, it predicted a highly distorted shock structure. So basically what I did was I implemented a moving frame of reference technique and focused on only modeling a small portion of the shock tube. So this allows for a variable resolution grid. So for example, here I'm showing the computational domain for the east simulations. We use axisymmetric flow and the domain is only 0.7 meter long. The diaphragm is located at x equal to 0, and then on the right you have test gas, and on the left you have the driver gas. There is a heavily refined region within the 4 centimeter vicinity of the diaphragm, where we target the shock to capture. So and then we move the grid along with the shock. So in the laboratory frame, shock moves from left to right, and in the moving frame, the shock stays steady somewhere in this region, and the undisturbed test gas flow enters into the shock uh, from right to left. So this is realized by the um, boundary conditions. So again, these were not like, these features of the code were not present by default, but it was very easy to define them and implement them. So then we give an inflow boundary condition on the left, and then the flow exits on the right. Sorry, I said the wrong way. It enters from the right and exits on the left. The center line, the tube center line is at R equals to 0, and we implemented the catalytic wall boundary condition here, again, which was not present by default. So we basically neutralized the ions. So in the chemistry file, we made changes such that the ions at the wall are neutralized, and then we made sure that the mass of other species are balanced. So it was done using US3D utilities feature. The whole domain moves with the shock, which is again given as like a boundary condition, or like a flow domain condition. So the whole, so basically the grid does not move itself, but when I start the simulation, all the computational domain has a initial speed, which is like in the direction opposite to the shock motion. So for example, if I'm simulating an earth entry condition at 10.5 kilometer per second, my moving frame speed will be that particular speed. So with that, and then there are some more details mentioned here. I will not go into them, but main point here is by implementing the moving frame technique, we were able to get advantage of using variable resolution grid. And if we do active shock tracking, which I will explain in the next slide a little bit. With all these changes, we were able to reduce the computational time by about 800 times compared to if you do a fixed frame calculations and try to model the whole 8-meter long tube using a uniform grid. So again, I'm showing the computational domain, and I would highlight this portion in the vicinity of the shock. The shock starts at x equal to 0 at time t equals to 0. And this is the case where the shock speed is about 9.6, and then the moving frame speed is 9.9 kilometer per second. So again, this is a minor detail, but we don't use the moving frame speed to be exactly same of the shock speed. This is done for the numerical stability purposes, because if for example, we want some relative motion of the gas with respect to the grid. If you give the exactly same shock speed, then at certain at certain finite volumes or fluid volumes, the relative velocity will be 0, and the numerical fluxes will be 0 or very close to 0. So they will create a problem in terms of numerical stability. So that's why the moving frame of reference speed is close to shock speed, but not exactly same. Now on this plot, I show the tracking of the shock. So basically we apply a pressure sensor in this whole computational domain. So we know the upstream pressure of the shock, upstream pressure in the test gas, sorry. So we detect the shock by whenever the pressure in the upstream region is more than 10 or 15% of free stream value, we say that the shock has arrived, and that location is tracked in time. So that's what is indicated by a triangle here. So this plot here is this region of the computational domain. At x equal to 0, time t equal to 0, we have shock here. And then as the time moves further, sorry. Sorry, my animation is kind of working weird. Okay. So at time t equal to 0, these dashed lines were showing the domain, the extent of the refined region. So basically what we want to do is, there was one way we could do these simulations was to heavily refine throughout, which will create problems in terms of computational cost. So what we want to do is move the grid in with the shock and keep moving this refined region as the shock moves. Refined region is here, and as we detect the shock going backwards with respect to the grid, we move these refined region boundaries backwards also, so that for uh, um, next few flow times, the shock is well contained within the refined region. And then again, we do this active shock tracking based on the flow results. And as soon as it reaches to close to any of the boundaries or nearby within a tolerance, so for example, here you see it's very close to the right boundary. So we keep moving these boundaries. Finally, at the end, so for in this example, for this shock speed, you reach at the test section at this time. And then, so the shock location is 7.98 meter, which is also the test section location. And finally, you find a solution there. So, uh, so I did not show any results for my project, but main point was that we were able to perform these simulations using the US3D utilities facility and like developing our own models. So in summary, US3D code enables for fast and robust predictions for a range of hypersonic flow problems. And the computational modeling is guided by physics and heavily validated against experimental data. And user-defined functions and subroutines can be easily tested and integrated into the main solver. Here is a list of a few references which I used in today's work. So interested readers can refer to these. And with that, that's it for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I would
Thank
like to
you.
just say, I think, would you like to take a few questions? I'm sure there are a lot of US3D questions among the students.
Yeah, I think so. One thing I realized was, because I did not work in detail of all these problems, I may not be able to answer all questions, but I can certainly um, listen to them and try to find an answer offline if I don't have it right now.
So, Duresh, you showed some flow over a double cone.
Yes.
And you had two profiles, two results. One, what's the difference? The density of mesh points? I didn't quite get all of that. No, not that one.
This one.
No, you had shock. Yes, this one, right here. 4 levels versus 6 levels.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So here, so basically there was a base flow calculation done on a coarse grid, and then there was a grid convergence study performed. Based on that, they found a reference solution. Okay, and that was done like a direct numerical simulation using a heavily refined grid. Then they had that reference solution, and then they wanted to use less number of points using AMR. So this is like going from 1 to 6 levels of AMR near the shock region. And the AMR is performed based on the density gradient. So wherever they have a strong density gradient, that has 6 levels of AMR. And then going away from that location, the cells become bigger and bigger.
Okay. And the flow was computed starting at the leading edge?
No, I think it had some upstream domain as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the flow starts from left to right.
All right. Thank you. Oh, one more question. Did this paper do any heat transfer calculations? This is all for
The
cold
bolt.
wall. Yeah.
Sorry, this one?
No, the same one. The yes, that one. Any heat transfer calculations at all?
The paper I read, it was not having the heat transfer, I think. But yeah, I'm not sure. I can check back.
Okay. I can find it. You gave us the authors. Yeah. All right.
So when it comes to the non-equilibrium transition prediction, I think that's what Bolt is trying to do, right, at certain level. Is there any, there is no experimental validation at this point, but there have been other codes that are trying to do the same problem. Have they been able to show any validation against them? I can think of several codes from probably the One Common Institute or another piece of code that was built at Stanford that is trying to do the same thing. Has there been any cross comparison?
Yeah, there has been, but I do not remember the answer on top of my head. So I remember like in AIAA, there were like full sessions on just talking about Bolt, 4 or 5 talks back to back. And people have been comparing results against different solvers. I do not have that comparison on top of my mind, but I can certainly ask the person who did this research.
Because US3D, I think, was not specifically built with stability analysis as the main feature, of course, one of the features. So I was just interested in knowing how good it compares with other models which are just focusing on high-speed boundary layer stability analysis.
Yeah, and they have actually done some stability analysis in this using linear analysis and DMD, SPDMD, etc. So there are papers, and I did not mention them, but if you are interested, we can talk more later.
Yes, definitely. I'll take you up on that offer.
Yeah.
Do you think you could talk a little bit more about, let's say, for example, the double cone configuration and like what goes into creating a mesh whenever you're implementing AMR as well? Like, what does the process there usually look like?
So for the double cone, I did not do this, so I do not know. But yeah, I think reading the paper can be helpful, because in this particular paper they are mentioning every detail about like what all neighbors they consider when they perform AMR, and then there are different ways, like which if you want to have like more neighbors in the just vicinity of the cell, or like having neighbors not just next to the cell but the next one. So there were things like that, but again, I did not do that, so I'm not able to answer.
Gotcha. Okay. Maybe you could talk just a little bit more generally about, the time process it takes usually to create a mesh. That's like one of the things I've heard about, like finite volume codes in general, that it usually takes a long time, but like using something like AMR, I can see that kind of sped up a lot. Is that true?
So basically, grid gen or pointwise, they are used to generate the initial grid, and then AMR kind of modifies the geometry in the runtime. That's what I know. I have not used AMR, so.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna ask
I do
about
not know the time difference.
Yeah, I was also gonna ask about the AMR because I worked with Charles Hollander back in 2018 and watched him do his whole stuff over at Lincoln Lab with the flared cone.
Yeah.
And he didn't speak too confidently about it. I'm just wondering, like the AMR in general, is it output based or is it more heuristic driven? And like having worked with a code like Loci Chem from I think Mississippi a few years ago, they also have AMR implemented, and we were finding issues of it converging to like incorrect mesh solutions and giving bad results. So I just wonder what mitigation strategies for this have been employed in US3D, given that this is a known issue.
Yeah, so I can understand why Charles was not confident about it, because the thing is, like, they were still developing the AM where like basically I generated my own variable resolution grid and I keep it moving from one once the shock is near to one of the boundaries, I move my grid from one location to other. And if I was able to do AMR, I will just do it. So the AMR was still in development that time, but it has been three years. So now they have validated it against some cases. So for example, the shock tube problem should be giving reasonably accurate results with AMR. However, complex flow geometries such as these double cone or double wedge flows, I was not following up what improvements are done. So I think I can note down your question and ask to some of my colleagues if they can.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, part of that cut out. I've been having some lag issues on my end, but thanks, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Okay, thank
So
you.
Dugas, early on in your presentation, you showed us about a half dozen situations, hypersonic flows that US3D could treat. Could you go back? Yes, that one.
Yeah, yeah, just some subset of the flows.
Okay, so where is US3D really, really good, and where does it tail off? What type of problems is it really suited for? You know, it can really knock it out. And is there a class of problems that it doesn't do as well?
So since like almost a decade, US3D has been really good in predicting flow over blunt bodies like steady flow, especially. Of course, there have been like improvements in the unsteady regions, like the size of separation bubble, different stabilities, growth, transient growth analysis, etc. They have been developing that capability. And even for my shock tube problem, the code by default did not have the capability to solve it in a accurate manner. So for example, there is the code uses iterative implicit algorithm, where within a implicit time step you perform sub iterations to compute the Jacobian. And then depending on how many number of those sub iterations you perform, the accuracy of the linear system is dependent on that maximum number of sub iterations. So for example, for steady shock simulations, such as where the shock itself is not moving at high speed, such as like flow over a space vehicle or flow over a cone, um, a total number of 4 sub iterations were sufficient to get a convert solution. But in my case, in the shock tube problem, the shock itself was moving at really high speed. And then if you do just 4 iterations, you still get a solution which is heavily dissipated, and you get a shock speed which is much lower than what the actual shock speed should be. So, and we actually did not even find that out like first few months. We got a solution and it was giving us some stable results, giving some reasonable shock speed. We did not know what the actual shock speed should be, but it was kind of a rabbit hole to chase that when we tried to like validate that against analytical shock tube simulations for lower Mach, and we saw that it kind of predicts a wrong shock speed if you use just 4 sub-iterations. So then I did a grid convergence study, I did a numerical convergence study, and I found out if you increase the number of those sub-iterations from 4 to 30 or 100, you increase the accuracy in wave speeds. And then finally, I use a value of 40 sub-iterations in my calculations. So yeah, I think it would have been, I think it would have been helpful if I presented my PhD work. But again, for this presentation, I just wanted it to be an overview. So
Okay. So
the other thing is like the limitations of the code, they come out as we keep solving more and more complicated problems. So like last 30 years, nobody even knew that this problem can exist when we solve the US3D in its vanilla state kind of for this high speed shock propagation case. But now the code has the capability. Now we know what should be changed. So
the wake flow behind a space vehicle, that's the fluid dynamics as well as the plasma propagation downstream as well?
Yeah, so this is like a dissociated ionized gas, and then depending on the length and time scales, I think they use a frozen versus reacting chemistry.
Okay.
The code has capability for both.
Okay, thank you. So colleagues, it's 3:35. We've kept Dr. Shandell beyond an hour. So there's time for one more question. Okay, one more question. Any questions?
I'm
Hearing
going
none.
Go ahead, Vishnavi. Mine's not.
No, I was just going to make a comment. Please go ahead, Humberto.
Okay, just a quick question, curiosity. You said a lot of the chemistry models you linked because you work with NASA on those. What about the ablation models? Are those something you guys developed in-house, or is it also from NASA? Do you know?
The ablation modeling is also done in conjunction with NASA. Yeah, I mean, the US3D has the thermal response, mainly with NASA Ames, the collaboration is performed. So like some of our colleagues, they have, who are the alumni from the lab, are now working at NASA. So the ablation modeling is kind of a joint thing.
I was just going to say that I'm probably going to save a lot of questions for tomorrow's talk on transition. So yeah, probably I'll direct them towards Professor Candler.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, thank you guys. And I'm sorry that I was not able to answer the specific questions because I realized that giving this kind of an overview talk is better when a professor or somebody who has worked on the development, the code development itself, they can be a better person to answer these questions. So feel free to just email me with questions. I can just direct them to my colleague who have worked on the code development actually. And I was just using what was there and doing some improvements depending on my problem. And again, Professor Candler is talking tomorrow. So I think most of your doubts can be cleared tomorrow, or you can, I don't know, you can learn more tomorrow. But I hope at least I was able to give you some overview.
Very well done, Dr. Shandell. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. Thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Another thing I wanted to say was, if there is interest, I can talk about my PhD project in detail, like 20-minute presentation. If there is an interest, if anybody wants to know about the numerics, what goes behind. So yeah, let me know.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yep. Thanks. Vishnavi, you done? You're in control.
Yes, I just said thank you and I'll stop the recording.
All right.
Yeah,